Hello everyone and welcome back to another episode of the Dungeon Learner's Guide. Today we've got another Commander's Guild deck tech. It's all your equipment are belong to us. We are randomly selecting a card from scryfall.com, working with a budget of $100 or less, and building a deck around a chosen theme, making a commander deck here. So if you haven't seen this before, this is our 7th episode, so go ahead and check out some of the previous ones, but our random card of the week, in this case, is going to be the Ogre Geargrabber. He's 4 red for a 4/4 Ogre warrior creature, and whenever he attacks, gain control of target equipment and opponent controls until end of turn, attach it to Ogre Geargrabber, and when you lose control of that equipment, unattach it. So, a bit of a weird card. One that led us down a bit of an equipment and artifact theme, and I figured there were a couple of key cards I wanted to try out, and once I got going, I found a weird combo that this deck is kind of built around, which we'll get into later. But first, we have our commander, well, in this case, commanders. For the first time we're doing partners, we have Akiri Lineslinger. She is a red and a white for a 0/3 core soldier ally with first strike and vigilance, and she gets +1/+0 for each artifact we control, and of course, partner. And her partner, Silas Wren, Seeker Adept, 1 blue/black for a 2/2 Death Touch human, and whenever Silas Wren, Seeker Adept deals combat damage to a player, choose target artifact card in your graveyard, and you may cast that card this turn. So, by using these two, we're going to use our equipments, we're going to use our artifacts to pump up Akiri's power, we're going to use Silas to recur our artifacts if we ever lose them. So they're both going to be very useful, and since they're a 2 and 3 costs individually, they're going to be much easier to cast, and we'll get them on the board very quickly. Now, going through this deck, we have a couple of themes that we played into. Some of them we've already mentioned. The first one, of course, equipment. And I like Bearded Axe in this deck quite a bit. It's a 2 and a red for an equipment. An equipped creature gets +1/+1 for each dwarf, equipment, and or vehicle we control, and it equips for 2. Now, we don't really have any dwarves or vehicles, but it's in there for the equipment, and there's tons of other equipments. Some of the normal ones, some of the ones that you might not see very often, and hopefully some of our opponent's equipment that we can kind of steal throughout the course of the game. Our next major theme, as I just mentioned, is stealing our opponent's equipment. So there's a lot of strange cards, especially back from like the Mirrodin era, that steal equipment or help us control enchanted equipment, such as Carry Away. So that's blue for an equipment. And when Carry Away comes into play, we unattach enchanted equipment, and then we control the enchanted equipment. So we can steal someone else's Skull Clamp, we can steal someone else's Lightning Greaves, or whatever they have on the board, or, which again we'll get into later, there's a bit of a combo, and this card can become much better than that. And our third major theme is tying into what we just mentioned with Carry Away, is Bludgeon Brawl. It's 2 and a red for an enchantment that turns every non-creature, non-equipment artifact into an equipment with equip X, and equipped creature gets +X+0, where X is that artifact's converted mana cost. So we can turn all of our opponent's artifacts into equipment, because this doesn't just hit our stuff, and then we can use something like Carry Away to steal someone's Soul Ring, or someone's Blightsteel Colossus, or any other massive artifacts that they might have on board. Now, as I just mentioned, Bludgeon Brawl, a pretty key element to this deck, and for the first time doing one of these, we actually have 4 key cards, and this is that weird kind of janky combo I mentioned earlier. First off, we have Mycosynth Lattice, which is almost a third of our budget just in itself, but I felt it was important enough to include. It says all permanents are artifacts in addition to their other types. All cards that aren't in play, spells, and permanents are colorless, and players may spend mana as though it were mana of any color. The second 2 clauses there, while useful, are not what we're looking for. The first one is the important one, turning everything into an artifact. That then leads us to Bludgeon Brawl, which turns all non-creature, non-equipment artifacts into equipment. So with Mycosynth Lattice and Bludgeon Brawl, every single permanent on the board, except for creatures, are now equipment. We then can cast something like Armory Automaton, which when it enters the battlefield or attacks, we can attach any number of target equipment to it. That does not say target equipment you control. We can take any equipment on the battlefield. So if we have Mycosynth Lattice, we have Bludgeon Brawl, we play an Armory Automaton, we attach every single non-creature permanent, including our opponent's lands, our opponent's enchantments, our opponent's artifacts, onto Armory Automaton. And then the final cherry on top of this combo is a card like Fumble. For 1 and a blue, we return target creature to its owner's hand and gain control of all auras and equipment that were attached to it, then attach them to another creature. So we go through all the steps. We've got everything's an artifact with Mycosynth Lattice. Everything's an equipment with Bludgeon Brawl. We've taken all of our opponent's permanents with Armory Automaton, and then we cast Fumble, returning the automaton to our hand and gaining control of every single permanent on the battlefield that is not a creature. So it's a little bit janky, a little bit weird, but the goal is to pull it off at least once, hopefully. So we'll see how that goes. The other thing, too, as I was going through and building this deck, there were a couple of cool interactions that we ran into. The first one that I want to point out is Cranial Plating plus Mycosynth Lattice, and we could very easily replace Cranial Plating in this situation with Akiri because they have very similar text, but Cranial Plating is an equipment for 2 mana that gives equipped creature +1/+0 for each artifact we control, which is the same text that Akiri has. It also has black, attach Cranial Plating to target creature you control, so we can do that at instant speed, and it equips for 1. With Mycosynth Lattice on board, and everything being an artifact, we could turn all of our lands into artifacts, all of our creatures, so Cranial Plating will be giving a massive boost, even just for playing lands and doing our normal game plan. The next cool interaction that I ran into was Ardenn, Intrepid Archaeologist, and Valduk, Keeper of the Flame. So Ardenn is 2 and a white for a 2/2 core scout that says at the beginning of combat on our turn, we may attach any number of auras and equipment we control to target permanent or player. So if we have 5 equipment on board, we are able to take all 5 equipments with Ardenn and put them on target creature, and we will target Valduk. And he is a 2 and a red human shaman 3/2 that says at the beginning of combat on your turn, for each aura and equipment attached to Valduk, create a 3/1 red elemental creature token with trample and haste that are exiled at the next end step. So we take our 5 equipment with Ardenn, put them onto Valduk, make 5 3/1s, swing in with the 3/1s, and then we create a massive board very, very quickly, or we are able to swing in for a lot of unseen damage that our opponents aren't expecting. So, coming to the end of our deck tech, the total deck price was $98.98, which is just under our $100 budget limit, and as I'm sure you may have guessed from some of the earlier pictures, Mycosynth Lattice is the most expensive card in this deck. It is $31.40. Like I said earlier, almost entirely 1/3 of our budget on its own. But with all the things that steal artifacts or steal equipment and care about artifacts, it felt like a card I just had to try to squeeze in. If you're looking to make this deck and you wanted to cut Mycosynth Lattice, obviously you can. Unfortunately, there is no real good replacement for it. There's a reason it's $30. So the deck still runs and still functions without Mycosynth Lattice, but the combo I mentioned earlier with Bludgeon Brawl wouldn't quite work without Mycosynth Lattice, so something to keep in mind. Now, the next thing we're going to do with this deck is we're going to get into some gameplay. And the gameplay that we're going to run into involves 3 opponents. We've got Nekusar, the Mind Razor, which is being played by Jason. We've got Korvold, Fey Cursed King, being played by Bilal, and Brago, King Eternal, played by Shawn. Now, when I first saw this list of who our opponents were going to be, it was a little bit scary. If you were to put together a list of all the high-powered commanders you probably don't want to see sitting across from the table, all 3 of these would be on it. I could take a very good guess as to what they're all going to do. Nekusar is going to draw a bunch of cards for everybody, do a lot of damage. Korvold is going to sacrifice a lot of their own permanents, probably very aristocrat-y. And then Brago is going to blink a lot of their own permanents, make a ton of value, and probably try to win the game that way. So we'll see how we match up. Hopefully we put up a good show. And I will see you guys after the game. I hope you enjoy it. At the start of the game, Jason goes first, followed by Bilal, Shawn, and myself. Jason plays a crumbling necropolis on his turn. Bilal plays a rootbound crag. Shawn plays a plains. I play a terramorphic expanse, cracking it for a mountain. Jason plays an island and then casts Izzet Signet. Bilal plays Rogue's Passage and casts Elysian Caryatid. Shawn plays an island and foretells a card. I play a plains and cast Azorius Signet. Jason plays a swamp and casts Propaganda. Bilal casts Sylvan Library but misses his third land drop. Shawn plays a plains and casts Ghostly Prison. I play an island and then cast Akiri. Jason plays Fevered Visions, and then in his end step, draws a card from the Fevered Visions. Bilal draws 3 cards from Sylvan Library, paying 8 life to keep all 3 of them, and he then plays a mountain, and casts Reclamation Sage, destroying Fevered Visions. Shawn plays a Cryptic Caves, and casts Azorius Signet, and then foretells a card. I play a swamp, I cast Silas Wren, and then I attack Bilal for 2 with Akiri, but he blocks with Reclamation Sage. Jason casts a Stormfist Crusader, and then he casts Lightning Greaves. He then equips the Lightning Greaves to the Stormfist Crusader. Bilal draws 3 from Sylvan Library and puts 2 back before playing a Fabled Passage and cracking it for a swamp, and then he casts Korvold, sacrificing Elysian Caryatid, drawing a card and putting a +1/+1 counter on the dragon. On Shawn's turn, he casts Eldrazi Displacer, and in his end step I cast Tear to destroy Jason's Propaganda. Then on my turn, I play a mountain and cast Mycosynth Lattice, turning everything into an artifact before attacking Jason for 9 with Akiri. In Jason's upkeep, everyone draws a card and then loses a life thanks to the Stormfist Crusader, and he then plays Dragonskull Summit. Bilal draws 3 with Sylvan Library, putting 2 back, plays a Bloodstained Mire, cracks it for a forest, which triggers Korvold. He then casts a Talisman of Resilience, and then Jury, Master of the Review, and finally, Blood Artist. On Shawn's turn, he plays an island, and then foretells a card. On my turn, I play an Exotic Orchard, and cast Kazul's Toll Collector, and then cast Kemba Ka Regent. I then move to attack Bilal for 12 with Akiri, and he blocks with Blood Artist, draining me for 1, and putting a counter on Jury. In Jason's upkeep, everyone draws a card and loses a life, and he then casts Blasphemous Act. In response, Shawn casts a Glorious Protector from Foretell, exiling the Eldrazi Displacer and bringing it back to play after the board wipe resolves. And when he dies, Jury does 1 damage to Shawn, and then Jason casts Viceling. In his upkeep, Bilal casts Bedevil to destroy it. He then draws 3 with Sylvan Library, putting 2 back, and then decides to play a Copper Line Gorge. And he then casts Swiftfoot Boots. Shawn plays an island and casts Mist Meadow Witch. On my turn, I play a swamp, and then I recast Akiri Line Slinger, and cast Akiri Fearless Voyager. Jason casts a Mind Stone. Bilal draws 3 with Sylvan Library, putting 2 back, and then casts Acidic Slime, destroying the Ghostly Prison. He then casts a Wayfarer's Bauble and equips the Swiftfoot Boots to Acidic Slime. Shawn plays an island and casts Brago. I play a mountain, and then I cast Sidri Galvanic Genius before attacking Jason for 13 with a Kiri. Before the damage, Jason casts Croesus Charm to destroy Mycosynth Lattice. Before that resolves, I activate Sidri to give Akiri Death Touch and Lifelink while she's still an artifact, and Jason then takes 1 damage. In my second main phase, I cast a Brass Squire. On Jason's turn, he casts Nekusar and equips Lightning Greaves to him. Bilal draws 3 with Sylvan Library, taking 3 damage because of Nekusar, putting 2 back, and then drawing an extra card because of Nekusar and taking another damage. He then plays a Smoldering Marsh, casts Korvold, sacrificing Sylvan Library when he enters, drawing a card, taking a damage, and putting a counter on the dragon. Shawn draws 2 and takes 2 from Nekusar, before playing a Myriad Landscape. On my turn, I draw 2, taking 2 from Nekusar, play a Plains, and then cast Silas Wren and Dalakos Crafter of Wonders. On Jason's turn, he draws 2. He plays a Temple of Epiphany, scrying 1 to the top, and then he casts Damnation. In response, Shawn uses Mistmeadow Witch to exile Brago and Eldrazi Displacer, returning them to the battlefield at the end of turn, and then the spell resolves, destroying all creatures. On Bilal's turn, he plays a Rhythm of the Wild, and then casts a Winding Constrictor, before cracking the Wayfarer's Bauble for a Swamp. He then equips the Swiftfoot Boots to Winding Constrictor and attacks Jason for 4. Shawn plays the Plains, and then casts an Arcane Signet, cracks Myriad Landscape for 2 Plains, attacks me for 2 with Brago, exiling himself and Arcane Signet, returning them to the battlefield. On my turn, I play a Plains, recast Silas Wren, and then cast Zerda the Dawnwaker. Jason casts a Dockside Extortionist, making 7 treasures, and then uses the treasures to cast Nekusar. He equips the Lightning Greaves to Nekusar and casts Time Reversal. This shuffles everyone's hand and graveyard into their library and draws them 7 cards, with each of Jason's opponents taking 7 damage from Nekusar. Once that resolves, he plays a Grixis Panorama as his land for turn. Bilal draws 2, taking 2 from Nekusar, plays a Temple of Malady, scrying 1 to the bottom, and he then dumps his hand on the board, casting Jury, Master of the Review, Talisman of Indulgence, Sylvan Ranger, Skull Clamp, and Witch's Oven. When the Sylvan Ranger enters, he searches out a forest, putting it to hand, and puts 2 +1/+1 counters on his creatures thanks to the Rhythm of the Wild. Shawn draws 2, takes 2, plays an island, casts a Soul Ring, casts Sky Diamond, foretells a card, casts a Hero of Bredegard, casts an Angel of Serenity, which will exile Jury, Zerda, and the Sylvan Ranger. In response, Bilal sacrifices Jury to the Witch's Oven, making 2 food tokens and doing 3 damage to the Eldrazi Displacer. Shawn then attacks Jason for 2 with Brago, who will exile himself, Angel of Serenity, and all of Shawn's mana rocks, returning them to the battlefield, and putting 5 counters on the Hero of Bredegard. This also allows the Angel of Serenity to exile Eldrazi Displacer and Silas Wren. He then casts Raven Form to exile Jason's Lightning Greaves. On my turn, I draw 2, take 2, play an island, and then I cast a Palladium Mirror, an Armory Automaton, which will automatically equip Bilal's Swiftfoot Boots and Skull Clamp to it as it enters, and then I cast a Thopter Foundry. On Jason's turn, he draws 2, casts a Dimir Signet, casts a Howling Mind, and then Windfalls. In response, Shawn casts a Saw It Coming, but Jason counters it with Counterspell. Bilal also sacrifices a food to gain 3 life. We then all discard our hands, draw 5, and each of Jason's opponents take 5 from Nekusar. Jason then plays a Halimar Depths, rearranging his top 3 cards. On Bilal's turn, he draws 3, takes 3 from Nekusar and the Howling Mine, casts Brass's Bounty, making 10 treasures. He casts Korvold, sacrificing Skull Clamp, putting 2 counters on him, drawing a card, taking a damage, and giving him haste with Rhythm of the Wild. He then casts a Cauldron Familiar, draining his opponents for 1. He sacrifices the Cauldron Familiar with Witch's Oven, making a food and triggering Korvold. He then sacrifices a food, returning Cauldron Familiar to the battlefield, triggering Korvold, draining his opponents for 1, and then sacrifices 5 treasures, triggering Korvold 5 times, which allows him to cast Prosh, Sky Raider of Care, making 6 kobolds as it enters. He then uses Assassin's Trophy to destroy Nekusar, letting Jason put an island into play, and then casts a Blood Artist, and then attacks Jason with Korvold, sacrificing the Cauldron Familiar on attack, triggering Korvold, doing 1 damage to Shawn with Blood Artist, and killing Jason with Commander damage. In his second main phase, he sacrifices a food to return Cauldron Familiar to the battlefield, triggering Korvold and draining his opponents for 1. On Shawn's turn, he plays Island, and then casts Light Form, manifesting the top card of his library. He then attacks me for 2 with Brago, exiling himself, his Mana Rocks, his Manifest Creature, and the Angel of Serenity, returning them to the field. This puts 5 counters on the Hero of Bredegard. The Manifest returns as a Glasspool Mimic, which copies Angel of Serenity. The 2 angels exile Prosh, Winding Constrictor, Blood Artist, and Cauldron Familiar. In response, Bilal sacrifices 6 kobolds, Winding Constrictor, and Korvold, triggering Korvold 8 times, draining Shawn for 8. Shawn then casts an Eldrazi Displacer, he casts a Ghostly Prison, and at the end of his turn, I sacrifice my Azorius Signet to Thopter Foundry, gaining a life and making a Thopter. On my turn, I play a Mountain and cast Carry Away, gaining control of Bilal's Swiftfoot Boots. I then cast an overloaded Vandal Blast, destroying all of my opponent's artifacts, and with the spell on the stack, I hold priority to activate Liquimetal Coating, turning Shawn's Ghostly Prison into an artifact. In response, Shawn uses Eldrazi Displacer to exile my Thopter token, and then the Vandal Blast finally resolves. I then recast Akiri. Bilal's turn, he plays a Field of Ruin, he casts a Zulaport Cutthroat, an Elvish Visionary, drawing a card, casts a Woe Strider, making a Goat token, and then he casts Pitiless Plunderer. But before that resolves, Shawn exiles Angel of Serenity with Eldrazi Displacer, putting Prosh back to Bilal's hand. It then returns to play and exiles Bilal's Zulaport Cutthroat, Elvish Visionary, and Woe Strider. In response, Bilal sacrifices the Visionary, Goat, and Cutthroat to the Woe Strider, scrying 3 and draining Shawn and I for 3. The Plunderer then resolves. On Shawn's turn, he plays a Plains, casts Confounding Conundrum, drawing a card, casts Flicker Wisp, exiling Akiri, returning her to the battlefield at the end of turn, uses Eldrazi Displacer to exile Flicker Wisp and return it to play, which exiles Palladium Mirror and returns it to play at the end of turn, and he then moves to combat. He decides to attack Bilal for 24 with the Hero of Bredegard, which kills him, and attacks me with everything else. Before the blocks, I use Thopter Foundry to sacrifice my Liquimetal Coating, making a Thopter, gaining a life, and decide to block the Eldrazi Displacer as well as Brago, going down to 2 life. In Shawn's second main phase, he manifests Cloudblazer to draw 2 cards and gain 2 life. And then at the end of turn, Palladium Mirror and Akiri return to the battlefield. On my turn, I play a Plains, recast Silas Wren, and attack Shawn for 5 with Palladium Mirror and Akiri. Shawn decides to block Akiri with the Flicker Wisp and takes 2. On his turn, Shawn plays an island, and then casts a Mana War, bouncing Akiri to my hand. He attacks me for 2 with Brago, but before the damage, I sacrifice Palladium Mirror to Thopter Foundry, gaining a life, making a Thopter, and blocking Brago. On my turn, I cast Mycosynth Lattice. On Shawn's turn, he attacks me with Brago and 2 Angels of Serenity. Before blocks, I tap 7 mana, sacrificing the lands I used to Thopter Foundry to make 7 Thopters, gaining 7 life, and blocking Shawn's attackers with 3 of them. On my turn, I play a mountain and attack with everything. Before the blocks, Shawn activates Eldrazi Displacer to exile Angel of Serenity and return it to the battlefield. When it returns, he exiles Silas Wren and 2 Thopters, blocking the rest. I decide to sacrifice my board to Thopter Foundry, gaining 5 life and making 5 Thopters, but at this point I realize I'm dragging out the game and I don't really have a way to win, so I decide to concede and Shawn wins the game. So that was a bit of a long game. Overall, it came out to be about 2 hours long, but the game itself was tons of fun. We were able to do some pretty cool things with Akiri and Mycosynth Lattice. I realized at the end I was starting to draw the game out, but I didn't really have much of a way to win, so I figured I would just concede. I didn't want to draw the game out too much, especially since the only way we were really going to survive would be to sacrifice our entire land base to Thopter Foundry, and I didn't want to do that. So, could we have won? Maybe, but it didn't feel like it was worth pushing in the end. We took second. I'll take that. It's pretty good with this deck, especially since Bludgeon Brawl never came up. We did get Mycosynth Lattice to play out for us a couple of times, and we were very lucky with a couple of exile effects that happened at the board, Ravenform in particular, that it didn't target our Lattice because, we need it. There's no way to get it back from exile from this deck, so I hope you guys enjoyed the game. If you have any suggestions for improvements to this deck or suggestions for future videos, please let me know. But that has been our episode for the week, and I will see you all on the other side of the Dungeon Learner's Guide.